Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
How many of you remember that commercial?
Yes. Good.
You know, that came out over 20 years ago now. It came out over 20 years ago, and it was a very successful, it's a successful ad campaign. Went over 20 years later. All you have to do is say, "Can you hear me now?" And people immediately think about that. And of course, it was for Verizon was the carrier, the phone carrier, and it was selling new customers on the basis of their great network connection. And people are concerned about being connected and having a strong connection. If you have a smartphone, whether it's an iPhone or an Android, you'll have one version or another of up in the right-hand corner. I don't expect you can see this. You can look at your own phone. Two little icons that tell you how strong a connection you have. One for your cellular connection and one for your Wi-Fi connection. And people like having a good, strong connection to both. If we didn't have a good, strong Wi-Fi connection right now, then the people on Zoom wouldn't be able to hear us. It's important to have a good connection, but much more than just having a good cellular connection or Wi-Fi connection, it's important to have a good, strong connection with God. Yeah. And if you ever have a problem with your connection, I promise you, it's not on the provider's end. If you have a hard time hearing from God, it's not a problem on the provider's end, it's your reception. And we're going to look at how to boost our signal, get a stronger reception, a better connection with God. And we're going to do that this morning in a sort of a unique way, perhaps not all the verses that some of you are already flipping to in your brain. But rather we're going to do it by looking at the example of a man who had an incredible connection with God. Sometimes a phenomenal connection with God. And that man was Moses. In Psalm 103, we'll begin our look at the life of Moses. In Psalm 103 in verse 7, it says, He being God, made known his ways unto Moses, his acts unto the children of Israel. The children of Israel saw the acts of God. He made known that. He made known to them by the actions that he would take care of them, that he would provide for them. They saw the man in the wilderness. They saw the cloud by day and the fire by night, the pillar of fire by night, and so forth. But with Moses, his connection was even greater. He not only showed him his way, his acts, but he showed him his ways. Moses understood the whys and the wherefores. He understood God, and he had this incredible connection. Moses is called a friend by God. That was a pretty singularly significant title for someone in the Old Testament. A friend of God. And we'll see that as we get into it. And we're going to look at this life of Moses, focusing in on three important characteristics that enabled him to have this close, special relationship with God. And as we read the records, I want you to be looking for those qualities. We'll point them out to somewhat, but you'll see them all throughout the records. And those qualities, those characteristics, those keys that we can emulate so that we increase a stronger connection with God ourselves are believing, meekness, and faithfulness. Believing, meekness, and faithfulness. And we're going to look at this life of Moses from different perspectives. One of the great keys to how the Word of God interprets itself is the key of Scripture buildup or narrative development. one of the basic important keys in how the Word of God interprets itself right in the verse. And this morning we're going to look at the life of Moses, putting together the different narratives where he is spoken about in God's Word. We're going to take those records and see and compare them, the records that cover the identical events, because it's important when you're looking at Scripture buildup, that it's not just similar events, but identical. And with Moses, his life is covered not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament. So we'll look at Numbers and Exodus. Moses is talked about in other places, but we're going to look at Moses' life in Numbers and Exodus, as well as the New Testament records of Acts and Hebrews. The New Testament will shine great light on those Old Testament records. The Old Testament is the New Testament concealed. The New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. And so when you look at the records and the increased understanding that they provide to the Old Testament records, boy, it puts some of those things in a whole new light. We're not going to read the entire parallel passages for the sake of time, and I encourage you to sometime do that, but for the sake of time, we're going to just weave those passages together to tell the narrative. And along the way, we'll also see an additional historical perspective at times on Moses' life. So different perspectives on Moses to show the keys to why he had such a great connection with God. You can turn to Acts chapter 7, which is where we will begin. Acts chapter 7, the record of Moses in Acts chapter 7, occurs during the time of Stephen speaking before the Sanhedrin. And there's this incredible narrative that he gives of kind of like, you want a real, in a nutshell, short, condensed version of the Old Testament, you get a lot of it with Stephen's testimony. Yeah. And so we begin there because it gives us a little bit of background before we jump into the record in Exodus. And in Acts chapter 7, and in verse 17, we read, "But when the time of the promise drew nigh, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt." So they had come, the people being God's people, Israel. They had come into Egypt under Joseph. Joseph, at that point in time, was second in command to Pharaoh because God had so mightily worked in Joseph and given him revelation that it saved all of Egypt from a famine that otherwise would have destroyed them. And with it, his family came in and they were taken care of as well. But it says in 18 that they grew and multiplied. They went from just being a family to a whole nation of people during the time they were in Egypt. And then in verse 18, till another king arose, which knew not Joseph. Many years have gone by. And it's not that same Pharaoh that had so honored Joseph. And somewhere along the line, they have lost track of how important Joseph's life was and the debt they owed to him and his people. And he knew not, this Pharaoh didn't know Joseph. Verse 19. "The same dealt subtly with our kindred, and evil entreated our fathers, so that they cast out their young children to the end they might not live." This Pharaoh got concerned. They said, you know what? There's going to be too many of these people. There are too many of them. They're too strong. Right now, they are our slaves. But the way this is going, we could end up being their slaves. And so he wants to put an end to them, and he commands that when a male child is born, when a boy is born, that the midwives would take and drown him in the river. That's what he tells them. But the midwives don't listen to him. And yet, the commandment is, even if they don't, the midwives don't listen, they say, these Hebrew women are so strong that the baby's already born by the time we get there, so there's nothing we can do to mess it up. But then the Pharaoh tells them, well, if you see a young boy, you take it down to the river and get rid of it. In the which time, verse 20, Moses was born. Not a good time to be born, is it?
No.
Wow.
And it says, and he was exceeding fair, exceeding fair. Keep that phrase in mind. We'll come back to it. And nourished up in his father's house 3 months. So for 3 months, he's nourished up, he's raised in his father's house. Those words, exceeding fair in the verse, come from the Greek word asteos. That same word is translated a proper child in Hebrews 11:23, and it's found in the Greek Septuagint translated a goodly child in Exodus 2:2. And we'll see that in a minute. But let's first go to Hebrews 11:23. And if you can, you can put a ribbon or something in Acts 7, and because we'll keep coming back there. And you can put another one in Exodus. And if you got a third ribbon, you can put it in Hebrews 11. We'll be jumping back and forth. In Hebrews 11:23, it says, by faith. By what?
Faith.
Faith. And that word faith is believing. Pistis, believing. By believing, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents. By believing, they kept him hidden. It wasn't just nobody was looking for these. It wasn't that Moses was such a quiet baby that nobody ever knew he was there. By believing, he was hid for 3 months. Took a lot of believing. And they hid him, it says, because they saw he was a proper child. Such an English-sounding phrase. It was a proper child. Moses was a proper child. In the ESV, the English Standard Version, it says that the phrase is that the child was beautiful. Proper child is that the child was beautiful. And they were not afraid of the king's commandment. It kind of strikes a little funny, though. It did me anyway, probably just me, that they hit him seeing that he was beautiful. Kind of made me think, well, what if he was an ugly baby? Go ahead, take him. Sounds like they're kind of superficial, weren't they? But there's more to it than that. That same word, that same phrase, again, asteos. In Acts 7:20, where it was translated exceeding fair, in the ESV of Acts 7:20, it's translated beautiful in God's sight. And Walter Cummins in his translation has it elegant in God's sight. So that kind of, to my mind, brings up another question. Why was he beautiful in God's sight? It's not just that he was physically beautiful. God didn't look at that baby Moses and say, boy, what a beautiful baby. I think I'll make him the leader over all of Israel because he's such a good-looking baby. There's more to it than that. And it has to do with God's foreknowledge. Not long ago, we did a seminar where we spent a lot of time looking at Pharaoh. And we saw with Pharaoh how important it is to understand God's foreknowledge when it came to Pharaoh's life. And that God knew what Pharaoh was going to do. God's foreknowledge was also so important when it came to the life of Moses. It wasn't that he was just such a beautiful baby, no more so than perhaps Isaac looked better than Esau. But rather knowing what these children would do when they grew up, the heart that they would have, the kind of person they would be. God in his foreknowledge knew that Moses would be a man of great believing, that he would be a man of great meekness, a man of great faithfulness. He knew the kind of leader that Moses would be, his strength, his ability to handle such a stiff-necked and hard-hearted group of people as Israel. God knew that this man not only would be able to handle them and put up with them, but have the compassion time and again to intercede for them. He knew the kind of man he would be, and so he watched over that baby Moses, and he watched over that child as he grew, and he watched over Moses his entire life. Look at Exodus chapter 2. Exodus picks up where we left off in Acts 7. Backs up a little bit here in verse 2. Exodus 2, verse 2. And the woman, speaking of Moses' mother, conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him that he was a goodly child, that's that word, that's that phrase we talked about, that is beautiful, she hid him 3 months. By the way, when I tell you that that's that same word, okay, that's the same word in the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. And it has a greater significance than many other more modern day translations from one language to another. The Septuagint was the version most often actually read in the time of Jesus and quoted from by Paul and other epistle writers. At any rate, that's where that comes from. She hid him 3 months. Verse 3, and when she could not longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and with pitch. That phrase slime and pitch, that comes from, what that means is it was, and I may not say this right, bitumen, what is it?
Bitumen.
Bitumen, okay, it's not even close. Bitumen, which according to Webster, is an asphalt of Asia Minor used in ancient times, has a cement and mortar. So they would take this kind of tar-like substance and she covered this ark that was made out of bulrushes or reeds, papyrus, that was then woven together and then covered up with this waterproof substance. And it also said that it was covered, it had a lid on it. It says ark. Do you ever hear people say Moses floated down the river in an ark?
No.
What do they always say?
Basket.
But basket's never used, okay? It doesn't say basket. They say basket because they used some reeds in it. And she did that and put the child therein, and she laid it in the river, laid it in the flags by the river's brink. And his sister, you'll find out that her name is Miriam, stood afar off to know what would be done to him. In Hebrews 11, it said that these things were done by believing. This was not an act of desperation, but rather an act of believing. In verse 5 it says, and the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river. And her maidens walked along by the river's side, And when she saw the, what is it? Ark among the flags, and that's not like the American and the Irish and whatever other flags somebody wants to put up. Flags are just talking about the reeds. She sent her maid to fetch it. She sent her maid to fetch this ark. That word ark is the Hebrew word tiba. And that means a chest or a box. A chest or a box. There are other words that are used for ark, like when it's speaking of the Ark of the Covenant. But this particular word is only used in connection with Noah and with Moses. And according to the Bible Dictionary, the New Bible Dictionary edited by J.D. Douglas, that ark that Moses was put into was a miniature version of Noah's. So Moses was put in a little miniature version of Noah's ark. And by the way, that ark was just a box, okay? It didn't have a bow on it. Didn't look like a big boat, in spite of the pictures you've seen with the animals sticking their heads out of the windows and that weren't there. Or, Kentucky, they have a great reconstruction of this somewhere in Kentucky. You can look that up online. Didn't look like that. Nice that they do this stuff, but it's not what it was. Just a big box. It didn't need a bow. It wasn't going to have a rudder. This wasn't navigated. It just floated. It was just a floating repository for Noah's family and all the animals. So it was just a box with a lid, and so was Moses. Oh yeah, where do we leave off? Verse 6? Yep. And when she, who's she?
Pharaoh's daughter.
Pharaoh's daughter. When she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him, and said, This is one of the Hebrews' children. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew woman, that she may nurse the child for thee? What a helpful little girl. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Go. And the maid went and called the child's mother. Well, could you have a better nurse?
No.
You have a better woman to nurse the baby than Moses' mother? Of course not. And so that was the plan. That was the plan. And there was Miriam just watching over her little brother. And when she saw that daughter of Pharaoh take him, she said, Hey, I know somebody that could nurse that baby for you. Should I go get her? And she said, Sure. And the maid went and called the child's mother, verse 9, and Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, Take this child away, take it home with you, and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages. I know some mothers that would have made a lot of money that way, I'll tell you what. She not only gets to nurse her own baby, but she gets paid for the job.
That's God.
And the woman took the child and nursed it. And verse 10 says, And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, Because I drew him out of the water. And that's what the word Moses means. It means drawn out of. And of course, it has another meaning, another significance. Not just that he was drawn out of the water, but that he would be drawn out of eventually that Egyptian household. And drawn and called out to a great purpose, a great mission. Moses' mother took that baby home with her, and she took it home until he was weaned. And then she brought it back to Pharaoh's daughter. In that culture, in that time and culture, that would typically be 3 years. 3 years, those very formative first 3 years of his life, he was raised in his parents' house, being taught about his people and their God. Being raised in that wonderful, wonderful atmosphere. And he continued to know as he grew who he was. And learned and understood more about who he was as he grew to become a man. In Acts chapter 7, you can go back there if you want. You can, well, we're going to be jumping around a couple places. So Acts chapter 7. Acts 7, concerning Moses' early life, being raised as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, as the grandson, the adopted grandson of Pharaoh. It says in verse 22, and Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and deeds. Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and mighty in words and deeds. That learning of the Egyptians, I'd like to read you a little bit, an excerpt here from the Bible History of the Old Testament by Alfred Edersheim that describes what that commonly would have been. In no country was such value attached to education, nor was it begun so early as in Egypt. Education was carried to a very great length, and in the case of those destined for the higher professions, embraced not only the various sciences as mathematics, astronomy, chemistry, medicine, etc., but theology, philosophy, and a knowledge of the laws. There can be no doubt that as the adopted son of the princes, Moses would receive the highest training. Scripture tells us that in consequence he was mighty in his words and deeds. So Moses had this very incredible education, an education that made him very knowledgeable about Egyptian laws, about what they believed, their religion, and so on and so forth. And as a result of that bringing up, it says that he was mighty in words and deeds. He was an accomplished man. Accomplished, a man of reputation, a man who could have done anything that he wanted given that position. He could have had a position probably like unto Joseph's position many, many years before. But we find out that Moses chooses a different path. In Hebrews chapter 11, in verse 24, we read, by faith, by believing, Moses was a man of believing. A man of believing, not just believing anything, not just believing, positive things, so that he could win friends and influence people, so that he was tapped into the secret of how to get what you want. But believing God, believing what he had been raised and taught about God. To the point, to the end, that not only did he understand that the Hebrew people, the Israelites, worshipped a different God than Pharaoh or any of the other gods of Egypt, that they worshiped the true God. Not only did he understand that and believe that, but he came to understand that he had a great mission in life. And here again, this is one of those great insights that we gain from the New Testament about the Old Testament record. By believing, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking for the reward. Moses made a big decision. The turning point of his life. He made an important choice. He chose to give up all of the status, all of the power, all the riches that he had and was entitled to as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He walked away from all of that. He walked away from everything that he might have had. I'm sure that people close to him at the time thought he was crazy. I'm sure that they said, as perhaps you've had somebody say to you at some point in your life, "What, are you crazy? You're giving up this bright future for God? You're choosing instead to serve him?" But that's what Moses did. He gave all of that up and chose to be mistreated, because when he chose to be a Hebrew, when he chose to be an Israelite over being an Egyptian, he was choosing slavery. He was choosing to be part of this group that was being not just slaves, but treated so terribly hard at this point in time. And he was willing to be mistreated with them and have that reproach instead of all of that other wealth. We're going to look at what Moses does choose and how that choice plays out. What happens in his life and how important it is. But first we'll take a quick break. We are in Acts chapter 7. And we see the pivotal decision that Moses makes. This choice to choose his people rather than the life of ease and power that he would have had he stayed as Pharaoh's son. In Acts 7 and verse 23, "And when he was full 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel." 40 years old, a time signifying a time of proving. That number 40 is always used with great significance. All numbers are in the Bible. It's one of the amazing things about the Bible. But 40 indicates a time of having proved something. And he, during those years, proved to himself just who he really was. And it came into his heart to visit his brethren, verse 24. "And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him and avenged him that was oppressed and smote the Egyptian." When you read the record from Exodus, it sounds like Moses kind of was just a little sneaky or something. It says he looked this way and looked that way, and then he got this guy that was beating up on one of the Israelites. But there's more to it. It says that he defended him and avenged him that was oppressed. Verse 25, and this is what you don't get from the record in Exodus. "For he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not." It wasn't just, "Hey, you're beating up on one of my guys." There was something more to it. He supposed that Israel would understand that God would deliver them by his hand. They had cried unto God. They had cried unto God about their bondage. And Moses already began to understand that he was going to deliver them out of Egypt, out of the hand of them. But they didn't understand. In fact, in verse 26, it says, "And the next day he showed himself unto them as they strove." There's a couple now of Israelites that are fighting amongst themselves. and would have set them at one again, saying, he would have reconciled them, saying, Sirs, ye are brethren. Why do ye wrong one to another? Why are you fighting each other? You're brothers. But he that did his neighbor wrong thrust him away, pushed him out of the way, shoved him aside, saying, Who made thee a ruler and a judge over us? Well, he's going to find out in a while here. It's going to take another 40 years. And because they shoved him away at that point, they waited another 40. Verse 28, Wilt thou kill me as thou didst the Egyptian yesterday? Oh. We saw you. You thought nobody was looking. We saw you. We saw you kill that guy. You going to kill me now like you did him? In Exodus chapter 2, you just stay in Acts, we'll be right back there. But in Exodus 2:15 it says, Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So when Pharaoh heard about this, he was looking to kill Moses. He was looking to kill him more because of Moses betraying him, choosing his people over the Egyptians than the act of killing the one guy. But Moses, still having the rights of his position, it wasn't something that he could just do right away, and it gave Moses time to get out of there. Continuing in Acts 7, verse 29. Then fled Moses at this saying, and was a stranger in the land of Midian, where he begat 2 sons. Moses goes to the land of Midian. And he goes to this land of Midian, and he marries a woman there, a Midianite, named Zipporah. And he has 2 sons. And it's just interesting with this stuff where you see how for all the things that God emphatically states at times, there are God's special situations, those exceptions that come up. Just like they weren't, God had told them even before the laws given to not take wives of other people. And yet, there you had Ruth. There you had, who's the one on Rahab. And now you've got Moses taking a wife of the Midianites. Verse 30. And when 40 years were expired, 40 years Moses is out in Midian. And there he is, 40 years later, when one day there appeared to him in verse 30 in the wilderness of Mount Sinai. Where? Mount Sinai. That's a familiar sounding place, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Well, let's see what happens there. There appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai an angel of the Lord in a flame of fire in a bush. Like I said, his connection was phenomenal at times. When Moses saw it, he wondered at the sight. What is this? A burning bush, I'm sure, catches his eye. But you stand there and you look at it for a while, and the thing's still burning, and it's still burning, and it's still burning. Well, you really wonder what's going on. And he drew near to behold it. As he drew near to behold it, the voice of the Lord came unto him, saying, I am the God of thy fathers, the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses trembled and durst not behold. Then said the Lord to him, Put off thy shoes from thy feet, for the place where thou standest is holy ground. The place where Moses stood was holy ground, because it was the place where God appeared to him, the place where God spoke to him. And you know what? You've got God speaking to you. You have God in Christ in you. And every place you go is also holy ground. verse 34. I have seen the affliction of my people, which is in Egypt, and I have heard their groaning. He saw, and he said it twice to really emphasize that he saw it. He didn't miss out on that. He didn't overlook it. He saw it. And he heard them. He heard their groaning. And am come down to do what? Deliver them. God saw it and heard, and he came down to deliver them. God was going to deliver them. And Moses got to play a role in it. And now come, I will send thee into Egypt. This Moses, whom they refused, saying, who made thee a ruler and a judge? The same did God send to be a ruler and a deliverer by the hand of the angel which appeared to him in the bush. He brought them out after that he had showed wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and in the Red Sea and in the wilderness 40 years. Moses goes in and he delivers them out. And the record in Exodus, again, we're not going to have the time to go through all that, but that record in Exodus goes into great detail of just how God did that. The mighty wonders and signs that he showed. And he did those things and walked with God in that incredible way, speaking the words that God gave him to speak, doing the works that God gave him to do. Even when Moses was back as an Egyptian, it says that he was known for his mighty words and deeds. Well, that didn't begin to compare with the mighty words and deeds that he was soon to become known for as he went to Egypt again, this time under God's orders. This time with that connection to God, that strong connection, where, boy, God told him exactly what to do, and he listened, and great things happened. He did it by believing, and that's what it tells us in Hebrews 11. You can go there or stay in Acts. In Hebrews 11, verse 27, by faith, by believing, he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured, has seen him who is invisible, God. By believing, by what?
Believing.
By believing, he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. By believing. And again, it's believing, and it's him being meek enough to God and faithful enough to carry out what God said. And by that, he kept the Passover. That doesn't just mean he kept that dinner. It means that he believed for what God told him would happen to happen. He believed when they sacrificed that lamb and ate the flesh, that everybody on that journey was going to have complete wholeness, complete health, to the point that among about estimated 2.5 million people, there was not one feeble amongst them, not one foot. It says somewhere else that their feet didn't even hurt, that's how God took care of them. You know, I can't walk without a mile without my feet being a little sore. Yeah. Imagine walking around for 40 years in the wilderness. And he believed that when they took that blood and painted their doorway with it, that angel of death, the destroyer, would have to pass over. He believed that, and it happened. He goes on to say in verse 29, by faith, by believing, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry ground. But the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, it didn't work out quite the same way. They were drowned. By believing, Moses did these things. Acts chapter 7, verse 37. This is that Moses which said unto the children of Israel, a prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren like unto me, him shall ye hear. That's quoted from Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, 18 to 19, where the life of Moses, his connection with God, was so exceptional that God compares the coming Messiah to him. A prophet like unto me. A prophet like unto me. You know, there's incredible parallels when you stop and you look at it, and we won't go into the detail of it, between Moses, Jesus Christ, and the Apostle Paul. Each one of them had the stewardship of an entire administration. Moses, the stewardship of the law administration. Jesus Christ, the stewardship of the Christ administration. And the Apostle Paul, the stewardship of the grace administration. And they have each, you can see in each, those same qualities of meekness and faithfulness and believing. Moses was a unique man. A man who was just ideally suited, not only because of who he was within his genetic structure, but the experience of his lifetime. He was uniquely suited to do what God called him to do. He wasn't just some bum off the street when he went and stood in front of Pharaoh. He was a man of reputation, a man who knew their protocol, a man who knew the best way to approach him, the man who was, of anybody, had more status than all the other 2.5 million people combined. He was knowledgeable in all of their ways. Just like Paul was uniquely suited by his upbringing and everything that he talks about in Philippians about his background. Where did I leave off? Somewhere in... Did I finish Acts? To whom God would... 37, that's where I left off? Okay, verse 38. Acts 7:38. This is he that was in the church in the wilderness with the angel which spake to him in the Mount Sinai, and with our fathers who received the lively oracles to give unto us, to whom our fathers would not obey, but thrust him from them, and in their hearts turned back again into Egypt. Moses was faithful, but you couldn't say so much for most of that crowd. Most of that crowd of Israel, they weren't faithful. They wanted to go back time and time again. But Moses was faithful. Faithful. You know, can you imagine? You got to just stop and put yourself in that place. All the times that Israel murmured, complained, griped, wanted to go back, while Moses is receiving the law because he's been gone a bit too long, they said, well, we don't know what happened to him. Aaron, make us a golden calf for us to worship. Give us another God like we had back in Egypt. And when that happened, God was ready to be done with them. I read the record. God was, hey, forget it. I can raise up a better people out of these stones. But Moses intercedes. Moses intercedes. He's not only that man who's willing to put up with them and strong enough to call them back and to not let them get away with a bunch of garbage, but also compassionate enough to continue to work with them. Look at Exodus chapter 19. We'll be there for a while now. The rest of well, we won't be back in Acts anyway. Exodus 19 and verse 1. So here we are at this point now in the record. They have come out of Egypt. And God's about to give them the law. And in verse 1 of 19, actually we'll go to verse 9. And the Lord spake unto Moses, Lo, I come to thee in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with thee, and believe thee forever. And Moses told the words of the people unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go unto the people, and sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes, and be ready against the third day, For the third day the Lord will come down in the sight of all the people upon Mount Sinai. Verse 16. And it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunders and lightnings, and a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. They just shook. Here it is. There's lightning. There's thunder. There's this thick cloud. And boy, when God speaks to Moses in this grand manner, the people just shook in their boots. And Moses, verse 17, brought forth the people out of the camp to meet with God. And they stood at the nether part of the mount. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke. The whole mountain is on a smoke. Because the Lord descended upon it in what? Fire. And the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly, like a volcano. Man, what a sight. And the voice of the Lord and the voice of the trumpet sounded long and waxed louder and louder. There's this trumpet sound that's long, and it just keeps getting louder and louder. What a show. Moses spake, and God answered him by a voice. And the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mount, and the Lord called Moses up to the top of the mount, and Moses went up. What a spectacle. What an incredible sight to behold. You know, this was a full MGM production. If they had done it back in the day, they would have had Cecil B. DeMille be the director. Now we'd have to get, I don't know, Christopher Nolan or James Cameron, one of these guys, to be able to make this thing really live. Because it was something to behold. But you know what? God didn't do that whole big show for Moses' sake. He did it for the people. That's what he said. It said, Lo, I come unto thee in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with thee and believe thee forever. I'm putting on this show so they know that it's me talking to you, that you didn't come up with this stuff on your own, and that they would believe you forever. They had every chance. Not all of them did. A couple of them did. Some of them did. But most part, they forget quick. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Because Moses, he continued to be faithful. In Exodus chapter 33, there's a great verse here about this incredible connection that Moses has with God. In Exodus 33, verse 11, it says, And the Lord spake unto Moses face to face, as a man speaketh unto his friend. And he turned again into the camp, but his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, departed not out of the tabernacle. He spoke to Moses face to face, as a man does with his friend. Face to face, like when you're there with your friend and you're just sitting there together, enjoying a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or something. And there you are, just face to face, that intimate, close relationship. That was Moses' relationship with God. There's another record where God says something very similar that we'll look at in Numbers chapter 12. And we'll see how unique this relationship was that Moses had, how the connection he has was so much stronger than anybody else at the time, even that big sister and brother that he had. Numbers 12, verse 1. And Miriam and Aaron. Miriam is that sister that watched over him, kept him safe. And Aaron, why, Aaron's his brother, the one who's the mouthpiece for him, who is like a prophet. That Moses is like a God to Aaron, and Aaron's like the prophet, speaking the words directly to him. These two spake against Moses, because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. So this is another wife. It's believed, a bit assumed, but it could very well be the case that Zipporah by this time may have died. And so Moses takes another wife. It calls her an Ethiopian woman in the King James. In most other translations, she is called a Cushite. Cushite in modern versions. It's the same back then, two different names for the same location. Ethiopia or Cush was the same location. That Ethiopia that's spoken about in the Old Testament, though, is not the same location as modern day Ethiopia. It would be the modern location of Sudan. So you have Egypt, and right below Egypt is Sudan, and below that is Ethiopia. But in that time, that right below Egypt was Ethiopia or Cush. Okay? And that's where she was from. That's where she was from. And boy, why? Moses married a Cushite? He married somebody? Well, that's just wrong. Why, Aaron and Miriam, they're all in a tizzy about this. They're all uproared about this. And it says that they spoke against Moses because of this. And they said, verse 2, hath the Lord indeed spoken only by Moses? Hath he not spoken also by us? Boy, God talks to us too. It's not just Moses. He talks to us. You know, Aaron, you're the high priest, and I'm the big sister, and he wouldn't even be around if it wasn't for me. And he's not the only one God talks to. Why, we got all the elders, all those elders that were appointed already. You know, all of them were people that had the Spirit of God in them. God talks to other people. So we need to let Moses know. Well, maybe we'll just talk about him instead, but we'll complain about what he's done here. And it says in the rest of that verse, verse 2, and the Lord heard it. The Lord heard it. And he wasn't too happy about it. Verse 3, now the man Moses was very what? Meek. Above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. I told you it was such a great key. He was meek above all the men on the face of the earth. He was coachable. He was willing to learn. He was receptive to God. More than all the men on the face of the earth, and that included his brother and sister. Verse 4, and the Lord spake suddenly unto Moses, and unto Aaron, and unto Miriam, come out, you three, unto the tabernacle of the congregation. And the three came out. I can just picture it. It's kind of like, the father hearing the kids in the other room, and they're quarreling, they're bickering. And okay, you three, come in here. I want to talk to you. I want to talk to you for a minute. So he calls Moses and Aaron and Miriam into the tabernacle here. And the three came out, verse 5. And the Lord came down in the pillar of the cloud and stood in the door of the tabernacle and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forth. Boy, you can they got to know they're in trouble. Not Moses, but Miriam and Aaron. Kind of like when I've seen that with kids. You call them, and they kind of come with their head hung down. They're walking real slow. That's them. Verse 6. And he said, hear now my words. I heard what you had to say, and let me speak, and you hear what I have to say. If there be a prophet among you, the Lord will make myself known unto him in a vision, and will speak unto him in a dream. If there is a prophet, you guys say you're all here. Well, if that is the case, I'll tell you how that happens. Okay? I'll speak to you in a dream. I'll speak to you in a vision. Verse 7, my servant Moses is not so, who is faithful in all mine house. Moses was faithful. Moses was faithful in all his house. Faithful in all his house, like Jesus Christ later is compared to being faithful in all his house. With him will I speak mouth to mouth, even apparently, and not in dark speeches. And the similitude of the Lord shall he behold. I won't do it in dreams. I won't do it in lightnings and thunders. I won't do it in all these ways that I have to do with all of you because you're just not spiritual enough. Because you don't have a close enough connection. Because you're not really tapped in. And so if I ever am going to talk to you, I got to go to great lengths to be able to do it. And boy, there's Christians today they want the dreams, they want the visions, they want the handwriting on the wall, the thundering voice before they will ever recognize God's voice. But God doesn't do that anymore. Nope. That's not the way he works. And boy, to want less than what the best is, to want a weaker connection than what's available is just crazy. That's how we had to do. That's how God had to speak to the rest of the crowd. But with Moses, he spoke to him mouth to mouth, mouth to mouth. What a great figure of speech. Not in dark speeches, not hidden. Wherefore, continuing in that verse, in verse 8, then were ye not afraid to speak against my servant Moses. Boy, considering my relationship with him, my friend, how was it that you weren't afraid to speak against him? Mm-hmm. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed, verse 10. And the cloud departed from off the tabernacle, and behold, Miriam became leprous, white as snow. And Aaron looked upon Miriam, and behold, she was leprous. Well, I guess that got the point across, didn't it? Wow. And then Aaron beseeches Moses, Moses, please pray for us, ask God to forgive. And Moses does. He's compassionate. He intercedes. And God says, well, fine. But you know what? If her father had spit in her face, she'd be put out of the camp for 7 days. Now, that's a Eastern custom when it's showing what was done in times of great disrespect of a child to a parent. And he says, put her out for 7 days, and they do, and then when she comes back, then everything's fine, and they move on. But boy, Moses had a connection unlike anybody else. And it's because he was so meek, so faithful, such believing. In Hebrews chapter 3, in verse 1, wherefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our profession, Christ Jesus, who was faithful to him that appointed him, as also Moses was faithful in all his house. There we have, again, a comparison of Moses to Jesus Christ. That Moses was such an incredible man and had this great connection. But it wasn't that God was a respecter of persons. It wasn't that Moses was such a pretty baby. That's why God did it. It's because Moses was that man that was meek above all the people on the face of the earth. The man who was faithful in all his house. That man who did all these things by believing. It's important to have a strong connection. People always want to make sure that they've got a good connection with their phones. They want to make sure that they keep that strong connection. And they don't want to go into an area that doesn't have good, strong coverage. Well, we need to always stay in fellowship with God, walking in his light, in that place where we are receptive to him. And if we do that, then we can walk with great words and works as well. God bless you.